Hello, everyone. Welcome to what week are we on? Week 6? No, week 5. Oh, no, I think it's technically week 6. Unit 5. So, apologize for not doing a lecture video last week. Uh, you know, I thought the material was pretty self-explanatory. With it just being in the PowerPoint, and didn't everything that I had was in the PowerPoint. There was nothing extra. You didn't have a test, you did the paper. So I probably will do one for Africa, just because there is some extra things. There's going to be a reading, plus things on the PowerPoint. So I probably will do a video for that one. But here is our video for Unit 5, the Baroque period. So there's a lot of stuff in this one. A lot of things happening, a lot of things going on, a lot of like our super famous composers, like we're going to start to see them here during this period. So there's a lot of stuff to discuss and kind of go over. So let's get started. I'm gonna share screen. Maybe. There we go. Okay. So, all right. All right. So Baroque period starts around 1600 to 1750. And we'll talk a little bit about that specific date when we get to our last composer, because there's kind of a reason why they typically will stop at 1750 with the Baroque period. Now, the Baroque, like I said, there's a lot of stuff. There's lots of like literature and art things that we could talk about, but we're going to focus more on the music side. So here are our learning objectives, pretty basic and straightforward, coming from the chapter in the book. Key figures. So I put Antonio Stradivarius. We're not really going to talk much about him, but just know that name because some of you have probably heard it before. Stradivarius was a very, very famous maker of violins, and his violins are not only the most sought after in the world, but they're also the most expensive, millions and millions of dollars. So know that he's alive during this period and producing those violins during the Baroque period. Vivaldi, he's a composer we'll talk about. Claudio Monteverdi, Descartes, one of the literature people that's mentioned in the book. Now, Elizabeth Jacques de la Guerre, she's someone that I added, and just trying to get a woman representation because she was not only a great teacher, performer, but she was also a really good composer too, working during this time. Galileo is alive now, so we're having lots of advancements in technology, lots of new discoveries. George Friedrich Handel is another one of our composers. Now I add in Giovanni Gabrieli because he's one of those people that's like kind of he's Renaissance really, but he kind of ushers in the Baroque era with his style of music. We did listen to one of his pieces, or you guys did, the Beata Esvergo, the Sackbut and Cornetto consort piece that I added in the last PowerPoint for the Renaissance. So that was his. He's known for writing more music for instruments, for brass instruments specifically, and for kind of doing this antiphonal kind of writing where you have two different choirs, two different sets of instruments or voices, and they're set up in different parts of, say, like a church or cathedral or something. So that's your definition for antiphonal. Hopefully that explains that a little bit better than in the book. J.S. Bach, he's our last composer that we'll talk about. Other famous people, King Louis XIV of France, Isaac Newton, Shakespeare. So yeah, lots of really important people. Terms, antiphonal, I mentioned that. Aria, let's see, so aria, recitative, those are things, basso continuo, those are kind of very heavily connected to opera. So we'll talk a little bit about opera. Um, Cantata, it's a church form, but it's something that combines instruments and voices and narration and all different kinds of things. Bach wrote a lot of cantatas, and you probably have heard some of his cantatas before in different church settings, especially around Christmas or Easter, any big celebration type thing. Chorale, it's just a different kind of vocal composition. Concerto, fugue, libretto is also linked to opera, but also oratorio. It's just the text movement. So pieces of music are going to have multiple movements now. So it's important to note that for certain things, like you'll hear a lot of like, listen to movement one or in movement two of such and such piece, things like that. So it's not just one piece, you have multiple movements of a piece. I already mentioned opera, oratorio, recitative, sonata. That's just a type of composition. Suite, same thing. Terraced dynamics, we'll talk about that. And then tutti. So tutti is when everybody plays. It's just a word that means everyone, all together, basically. It's an Italian word. All right, so those are the main figures, people, terms to know. So here are some important events. We have the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. We got the Pilgrims. So exploration, the colonization of America is beginning in the Baroque period. 1623, Galileo. The city of Boston is founded in 1630. That's big. Harvard University, 1636. The reign of King Louis XIV. I mean, he reigned for a very long time in France. So a pretty important figure, a very powerful monarch. Descartes, he's active, publishing things around 1650s, and Newton is publishing his findings around the 1680s. So musical stuff, Monteverdi wrote or performed, premiered, I guess I should say, his very first opera in 1607. We'll talk about that opera, but opera is being developed very quickly at the beginning of the Baroque period. You've got birth years for Vivaldi, Handel, and Bach, and Handel's Messiah, which everybody has heard the Messiah before. Gets his first performance in Dublin, Ireland in 1741. And then 1750, J.S. Bach dies. Bach, he's not heavily respected or really well known during the Baroque period, during his life. But afterwards, people realized like how great of a composer he was. And he was also extremely prolific because he had to write a bunch of music for church services. He worked in many different courts and for different church positions. So he just wrote a lot of music. And Bach's music is pretty much most of the stuff that we have to study whenever like music majors have to learn music theory. So usually people will kind of correlate Bach's death with the end of the Baroque period. So there's that. All right, so about the Baroque era. So I know you got a lovely, nice painting here by Caravaggio. Wonderful painting, but you see a lot of this, especially in the Baroque into the classical. a lot of action type paintings. Not just, people being killed or beheaded, which is what's happening here, but just more statues, more paintings depicting something in action. Um, I think about the Swing, which is a very famous painting from the Rococo period, which is kind of towards the end, I think, of the Baroque period. Very colorful, very just descriptive. Like there's just a lot of stuff in the painting. But it's almost like somebody took a picture while this girl or whoever is swinging, like just stopped, stopped time for this painting. It's really, really cool. Um, I don't have it in the slides, but the statue of David, talked about that from the Renaissance. Well, in the Baroque, they don't just have David as this masculine, beautiful Greek figure, but they have him like kind of in the act of throwing the rock, or he's like, hunched over, like he looks like he's getting ready to hurl the stone or whatever at Goliath, at the giant. So it's these paintings and statues just showing action. So that's very different, from the Renaissance to the Baroque. Um, and Baroque, so there are different thoughts about what Baroque means. So you could, like, some people think it's like odd, something that's out of the ordinary. They'll make allusions to like a Baroque pearl, which is just a type of, I think, a Spanish pearl, or that the Barroco or something is a Spanish Portuguese word for an odd, an oddly shaped pearl or something like that. So, um, and that's kind of true. I mean, we're going to get into a lot of things that are extremely different from the Renaissance. They are out of the ordinary. You're using different, completely different instruments and stuff like that. So yes, it is out of the ordinary. More emphasis on instruments, more emphasis on program music, like where the music kind of tells a story, has like a feeling or expression that's tied to it. um it's just a lot of different things going on in the Baroque, so that does kind of fit. Other people, think of the Baroque as being like very fancy, like the Baroque meaning something that's fancy, ornate, gaudy, things to excess. um which, we'll talk about that meaning when we get to the classical era, because the classical era will be like kind of a reaction to what happens or what happened during the Baroque period with the music and all that stuff. So, fancy, there's like lots of things added to the music, trills, turns, appoggiaturas, like all these different techniques, different notes that you add that to the music that just aren't even written out. So that kind of comes into play with that, meaning like fancy, gaudy, excessive, using all these different instruments, bigger performing groups, and all that stuff. So it's something that we'll discuss once we get to the classical era, and something that I might have you guys discuss on the discussion board. Like, you know, when, once I kind of explain the meaning behind the classical period and how it was a reaction to the Baroque, maybe I'll have you guys kind of discuss if you think that's true, if you can hear that or see that, and different things that we talk about. So, I list the different scientists, philosophers, Descartes, John Locke, the different famous artists. We've got the Caravaggio painting, but there's also Rembrandt's, Peter Paul Rubens, not Pee Wee Herman, but the famous painter. Literature, so not just Shakespeare, but Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote, Jonathan Swift, who wrote Gulliver's Travels and all that. So there's a lot of like really heavy hitting stuff happening in the Baroque period, not just in music, but in everything. Politics, monarchs. So, you do have these, bigger city states springing up all over Europe. That's a big thing. But you still have these nobles, these lords over certain areas. And then you also have absolute monarchs like the king and queens of France, England, all the big nations, all the big countries in Europe. And these monarchs have absolute power. Like you cannot refute what the king or queen of England or the king of or queen of France tells you to do. You cannot refute their laws. So that's kind of a continuation of what was going on in the Renaissance. But kind of like I've talked about before, these monarchs, these nobles, become even more involved in music and become patrons of composers. They employ musicians, they employ composers in their courts. Um, so, you know, yeah, I said the Renaissance, you start to see the separation of the church and music, but in the Baroque, I think it really becomes even more clear, like even clearer, that most musicians are being employed by nobles and other patrons rather than the church. Yes, Vivaldi, Bach, like they are employed by churches, but Bach, he was Lutheran, so he wasn't employed by the Catholic Church. So there's differences with that as well. The Catholic Church starts to lose a good bit of its power. It's the music, even it becomes more Protestant and especially more secular too. Um, Colonization of America, mentioned that. That's important. And then important inventions. So there's lots of things. You've got the first ever submarine. You got things like the slide ruler, calculating machines, blood transfusion. Like that's really important. You've got steam turbine, steam engine, things like air pumps. And then also later in the period, you have the piano, the tuning fork, other things that are also being invented. And then also like the traditional string family, violin, viola, cello, double bass, like those are um, invented, established during the Baroque period. So you start to see less of the other things like the viol de gambas, like the odd looking string instruments, and you see more of the violins, the cellos, the things we're used to. So the music of the Baroque, it's different, but there are still a lot of things that are the same. One thing that's different is that meter, time signature, like keeping a steady pulse, is way more important. You also see, well, there weren't, there were conductors during the Baroque, but most of them either played like first violin and they would kind of conduct while they played, or they might play harpsichord up in the front and they would conduct while they play. But yeah, you started to see more conductors, people that are keeping time, leading the group. So that just kind of reinforces that meter, that the time, the pulse is more important. Polyphony continues. We'll see that with uh, with J.S. Bach, with his fugues. His music is very polyphonic, although we don't call it polyphonic, we call it contrapuntal. So there's that. But homophony is way more prevalent, and especially because you started to have more like chords, like chord structure, actual harmony in different songs. Harmony is way more important. You started to see chord, like actual chord structure in songs and pieces of music. And that lends more to homophony. Yes, there are polyphonic elements, but having the chord there, this background structure, um, that it kind of revolutionizes the way that composers write. Um, so that's something that's different between the Baroque and the Renaissance. More focus on harmony, homophony than polyphony, and then instruments. So you have the rise of instrumental music, and with that you have the orchestra. So you start to see the beginning of the orchestra, which becomes the thing to like the ensemble to write for. It's like opera and the orchestra become kind of the driving forces in music, and kind of the measuring stick for composers. Like, did a composer write great operas or great symphonies or great, whatever, that starts to be the way that music historians and other people tell the difference between, say, Mozart and Beethoven and other like lesser known composers. So, who may have been great in their own right, but their music may not have been celebrated as much, or they may not have written a lot of great symphonies. Maybe they wrote other things. So, but new genres like the cantata, that's pretty much strictly for churches, like a church service. Um, it usually be about 15 to 30 minutes, and it includes lots of different things like narration. So speaking, you've got arias. So those are like solo pieces for the vocalists. Recitatives. Okay. So that is, it's like a movement of an opera or cantata or oratorio where the person is singing, but it's speech like. It's very much like sing speech instead of actual singing. So the melody is syllabic. It follows the text. There's not a lot of instruments. It's the basso continuo. It's harpsichord and like cello. So like two instruments underneath, just kind of giving them the harmony a little bit. They stay out of the way, but the recitative is a way for composers to like give you a lot of context, give you like the story without stopping. It just quickly moves the story from one big number, one aria to the next. So that's recitative. You got choruses where everyone sings. And then, of course, you got like duets, trios, smaller ensemble pieces. Concertos, usually it's a soloist. It can be any kind of instrument or vocal with an orchestra. Operas, so we'll talk a lot about opera, a staged musical drama for voices and orchestra. No talking. Everything is sung and it is staged. So costumes, set design, all that stuff. Oratorio is different because it's not staged. It's kind of like a concert. But usually it has like a religious theme, like the Messiah or something like that. But you'll still have soloists. You have a chorus up there. You have a full orchestra. It's just no staging at all. Fugue, we'll talk about that with J.S. Bach. Sonata, won't really talk about it now. We'll talk about it more in the classical period, but just know it's a multi-movement piece for solo instrument with piano usually. Um, Other things, program music. So like I said, music is not all of it is written about something, but sometimes like we'll see this with Vivaldi and other composers. Like sometimes there will be a story or something that goes along with the music, a descriptive title. So it's putting some kind of idea with the music or conveying some kind of idea through music, kind of like word painting, but a little bit different. The dynamics, we'll talk about the terraced dynamics. So Composers are experimenting more with like the extreme softs and extreme louds. And then, of course, like music in the merchant class, we talked about how the printing press revolutionized music by making it more accessible to everyone. That continues. Same thing in the Baroque. Um, it just kind of keeps steamrolling until now, where I mean, we all have access to digital pieces of music. It's kind of crazy how it's evolved throughout the years, but this started in the Renaissance with the printing press, and now it's just continuing to grow, especially now. You're starting to see composers, musicians become like teachers and start to teach members of the merchant class, the middle class, how to play instruments, how to compose, that sort of thing. So it's definitely changing a lot of stuff, and the way that people write, because you'll kind of see it's going to change the focus from writing for like church services, or like the court musicians, like the noble places. You're going to have composers in the classical and romantic era just kind of start writing music for themselves or for just other people to perform. So this is a list of like more in-depth characteristics. um let's see. Basso continuo. So just so I can explain this a little bit better. um so like I said, it's the harpsichord, so a keyboard instrument plus usually cello. You got two, maybe three instruments. It's usually a keyboard and one or two strings. That's it. um but it's realizing the harmony, so it's giving the harmony. And typically these notes aren't written out. um you'll have like chord symbols, like play the fifth of this chord, play the fourth, the seventh, and you modulate and all that stuff, change the key. So it's a difficult thing to do, and normally with those symbols it'll give you like just a bass line. So all of these musicians, especially the keyboard, like the keyboard player is kind of improvising while they play, which is really, really cool. It gives you the bass line, like I said, but you have two or three notes on top of that that you play, and you just come up with that while you're performing. So it can be different each time, which is awesome. So that's basso continuo. um like I said, very important in opera. That's usually where you'll hear it, either opera or oratorio. um I mentioned the string family, the woodwind families, bassoon, oboe, flute, clarinet towards the latter part of the Baroque. Like those are invented, established as like these are members of the orchestra. So that's important. Compositions are longer because they have multiple movements, and the terrace dynamics. So the book does an awful job. That definition is awful. Such a bad explanation, but it's changing the volume. Um so if a composer wants it to be soft, they'll have like a small group of instruments play. If they wanted to get louder, they will add instruments. They'll make the group that's playing bigger. So that's usually what terraced dynamics is. Like you're not telling the player to play soft or play loud. You're adding and taking away musicians to change the dynamics. That's the difference between regular dynamics and terraced. So if it's loud, you'll have lots of people playing, and then if it's soft, you'll have just a few people playing. It's the best way I can describe it. But that's really big in the Baroque era. And usually there's no crescendos or decrescendos, like there's no build up to soft or loud. It's just abrupt. It happens. So that's something that'll be very different from the Renaissance. Um, so the birth of opera. I know plenty of you are probably so excited about opera. Um, but opera was like the like entertainment of choice for so many years, for hundreds of years, for society. This was like their movies back then. You go to an opera, you can't go to a movie theater. You can't. I mean, you could go to a concert of other music, but if you wanted to see a story, you either go to a play or an opera. So, um, so opera began in Italy. So this is around the turn of the 17th century, so around 1600, and it was led by a group of people called the Florentine Camerata, because they were based in Florence, Italy. They, this again goes back to ancient Greece and Rome, so it's tied to the Renaissance. But it's just the idea of those dramas and how they would have a chorus that would sing. They wouldn't always sing, but they would sing different things. And these scholars felt that vocal music was much more expressive. It was a great way of expressing the text and expressing emotion within the story. So they were pushing for these completely sung pieces of music, or just these plays that were completely sung. Um, so they, were the ones that kind of commissioned and started getting people to figure out and write the first operas. Um, so the first ones were done in Italy, but I mean, not long after that, it spread throughout Europe, England, France, Germany. You would have um, opera houses all over the place. The best ones were still in Italy, but like Paris, I mean, Paris has a great opera house as well. So, and there are plenty of great ones in Germany too. Um, so opera, stage drama that is completely sung, no talking. The closest you get to talking is the recitative. Like I mentioned, the libretto is the text or the story of the opera. People that write the libretto are called the librettist. So there's that. Um, and then here's, stuff talking about like basic definitions of recitative, aria, and chorus. All right, so we're going to start talking about some of our composers. Um, so let me share screen again. We are going to start with Claudio Monteverdi. So Monteverdi, didn't mean to do that. Monteverdi is mostly known for being the first um, to compose opera. And he composed one of the first really important operas called Orfeo. We'll get to that in a minute. But Monteverdi was Italian, lived from 1567 to 1643. So he was about 76 when he passed away. Interesting. So his father was a barber slash surgeon. Back then, barbers did more than just cut your hair. They were dentists. They were, they performed minor surgeries in their offices, whatever you call them. Back then, the barber poles, like the different colors on the poles, would represent the different services that would be rendered at a particular barber shop. So Monteverdi is not the only composer whose father was a barber surgeon. There are a couple of others as well. So there's your interesting little bit of knowledge for today. So Monteverdi wrote both sacred and secular music. He wrote a lot of madrigals. He is, aside from his operas, he's well known for his madrigals. They're really great. So he was well versed in writing vocal music. So it was kind of a no-brainer for the Florentine Camerata to, approach him to commission a an opera. So Monteverdi, he was employed by a noble, the Duke of Mantua. Started out as a string player in 1590, and then he eventually rose to be the director of music there. Um, Now, his opera Orfeo, it's the first great opera, the first important opera that we have. Monteverdi is often called the father of the opera. And this opera, Orfeo, so it's based on the Greek legend Orpheus, Orpheus in the underworld. Orpheus marries Eurydice. It's all great until Eurydice dies. Orpheus is distraught, so he goes down to the underworld and tries to bring Eurydice back. So that's the story. It's the opera's in 5 acts. Most operas are in like 2 or 3 acts, so this one's pretty long. And it does call for a lot of instruments for that time, 41 different instruments. And this ranges from the lute, different strings like violins and stuff like that, the recorder, cornetto, the sackbut, those early brass instruments. The cool thing is though that some of those instruments would actually be on stage instead of in the orchestra pit. So that's pretty cool. There are 13 different roles, including a chorus. Most operas don't really have that many. Most operas don't really have that many roles. They kind of limit the number of roles, but this one has a lot. So you guys are going to listen to Tu sei morta, which means you are dead. And this is when Orpheus finds out that Eurydice has just died. So he is distraught. It's for a solo vocalist, Orfeo, Orpheus. It has basso continuo. So you're going to hear basically a lute and then another really deep low instrument, probably another type of lute that we'll talk about later on called the theorbo. But it's got the basso, and you won't see it in this video, but once Orpheus is done with his monologue thing, the chorus and orchestra comes in. So the music's going to be very sparse. It's just Orpheus, talking about how distraught he is. So the chords, the music is sad. It's dissonant. It's in a minor key. The melody, since this is recitative, the melody is conjunct. So the melody is like the notes are pretty close together. Um, since there isn't a lot of music underneath the vocals, it would be hard to have like a disjunct melody to have lots of leaps and stuff like that. So just be forewarned. This is kind of a traditional performance of Orfeo. So heavy makeup, interesting costumes. Just remember this is early opera, and just notice how the voice, how Orfeo's lines, his singing is just very syllabic. It's very fast as well. That's what recitative is normally like. So you guys can listen to Tu sei morta on your own. I already listened to it once today. Oh, never mind. Sorry. I did not mean to do that. Next slide. Come on. There we go. All right. So Antonio Vivaldi. He's a great composer. You guys have heard his music before, I promise. Um, Vivaldi was an amazing violin player, virtuoso, like one of the best. And he taught violin at several places, and he also wrote a lot of music, a lot of different kinds of music, but mostly he's most well known for his string um, string music. So um, he was known as the Red Priest. Interesting fact, because he had red hair. Now in the painting, that's a wig, but he had bright red hair, and he was also ordained into the priesthood in 1703. So he was really a priest, a red-haired priest. So aside from being ordained, he for a while, his kind of most important position was teaching violin, being the orchestra director at kind of like an orphanage boarding school. It's called the Hospital de la Pieta. And he taught violin, and he also directed the main orchestra. Now, this place was kind of like a school of the arts sort of situation. The so they were like very rigorously instructed in music. So the top orchestra was just as good as many of the professional performing groups of the day. So this was a great position to have. Um, After he left that, he spent many years just kind of composing music for people, for patrons, other commissions. He's an example of one of the one of the first examples of a composer kind of going out on their own, like not having a distinct like church position or a position in a court. One of the first to do that, Vivaldi. Now, the Four Seasons. So this is a concerto, and it's like four different concertos in one. Each of the four concertos have three movements, so they're multi-movement works, and it's a violin concerto. So the solo violinist is the most important part, and you'll see in the video that the soloist is like standing up in front of the group. And Vivaldi probably would have been the soloist because he would have also conducted. The soloist in this case is kind of, he acts as conductor and soloist, so that dual role. Vivaldi would have done that when he wrote this piece. So written around 1720, published in 1725. One of our first examples of like real program music, where you have descriptive titles and you have a poem text to go along with each movement. The text for this particular movement is down at the bottom. Spring has arrived with joy, welcomed by the birds with happy songs, and the brooks, amidst gentle breezes, murmur sweetly as they flow. And all of the movements have a short poem. And we're not certain, but are pretty sure, we think that Vivaldi wrote these poems. Each concerto is based on one of the seasons: spring, summer, autumn, winter. We'll listen to the first movement of spring, which is the most popular one. And he uses a lot of terced dynamics. So remember, that's when you don't have decrescendos, crescendos. It's just like sudden changes in the dynamics, soft to loud and then back. And usually he would take away um, take away instruments to make it soft and then add instruments to make it loud. I don't think he necessarily does that in this particular piece, but that's what a lot of composers do. So you guys can listen to this one. It's just the first movement, and you guys will more than likely recognize it. Now, the next person is not in the book. So this is a famous female composer of the day, Elizabeth Jacquet de la Guerre. She was French, born in 1665, lived to 1729, so she was about 64. Now she comes from a very musical family, descendant of like several generations of great harpsichord, keyboard builders, and performers in France. So Jacquet was, she was taught how to play, how to do all this stuff from a very, very young age. So her career started really early at age 5. I mean, she was already performing for King Louis XIV at age 5. It's kind of similar to Mozart and a lot of other child prodigies that we have in music. So Jacquet, she was married to a great organist of the time, Marin de la Guerre, in 1684. Now, Jacquet was a celebrated teacher, organist, harpsichordist, and composer in Paris. Here's the thing, she was a woman who her husband was also a musician. So normally during this time, the woman would not be allowed to engage in those activities because it would take away from the respect, the honor of the husband. But I think because of her family, probably because King Louis knew Jacquet had, seen her perform before, knew of her, he gave her royal permission, a royal blessing to teach, perform, and compose alongside her husband. So that is a big deal. Not a lot of women would have been given that, what they would have called an honor back then. I mean, it's obviously not right, but this is just kind of to show you like the mindset of the world back then. And that's one of the main reasons why we don't really know, like we don't ever hear about Jacquet. Like her music is awesome. And I'm sure she was an amazing performer. I mean, we don't have any, you know, any recordings or whatnot of that, but I'm sure she was because her music's great. But we don't know about her because she was a woman. So here we are now, finally being able to bring some of these great composers to the forefront, to life. Um, and that's one reason why I wanted to at least share one. Like there are others that I've researched. Jacquet just kind of jumped out at me because of her connection to King Louis XIV. I thought that was kind of cool, or just interesting. Um, but anyway, she composed a lot of different music. She even wrote opera. I don't know how much her operas were performed. I don't know really know if they're performed today, but I know a lot of her chamber stuff is performed today. But she was also very passionate about using music to express the text, which kind of goes back to the program music stuff that we've been talking about. Now, you guys are going to listen to a sonata. Now, this is different. It's not a solo instrument with keyboard, but this is like a chamber sonata piece. So it's two violins, a viol da gamba, which is basically a cello, harpsichord, and theorbo. You're going to see that the theorbo, like it's a lute, it's in the lute family, but it is huge. It's like having a double bass in your lap. Like it is insanely big. It has a very long neck, an extended neck. It even has two peg boxes for tuning purposes. But this is an instrument that was strictly used in the Baroque era, and really it was made but kind of for the basso continuo, especially for opera and other things, because they wanted an instrument that could use the lower register. Because the lute, it's a higher pitched instrument. They wanted something to get the bass notes. So you guys will get to see a theorbo in this video, which is really cool. You can see how big it is, and I mean, you notice like they really can only play the notes down in this area, which is why they would have to have a second peg box to help make sure that this extra set of strings are in tune. It's really crazy, but yeah, that's a theorbo. So enjoy that. It's a good piece of music. Now to our heavy, well, our first heavy hitter. So this is George Friedrich Handel. Most of you should be familiar with Handel. Um, he was a German-born composer, but lived much of his adult life in England. Spent most of his career in England. He was actually a British citizen. Born in 1685, lived until 1759, so lived to be about 74. Famous works: The Messiah. Everyone knows The Messiah. Water music, music for the royal fireworks, and a bunch more. Um, so Handel studied keyboard and composition where he was born in Halle, Germany, and he even studied law for a short time. But while he was studying law, he became an organist in Halle. And then he just kind of worked his way up, worked in an opera orchestra in Hamburg, worked his way to be the director of that orchestra in Hamburg, and then traveled through Italy, just really playing and studying the opera and the compositional style of Italy. So that was a very important time for him, a time where I think he probably came into his own as a composer. And in 1710, he was the director for the Elector of Hanover, who was to be the future King George the First of England. And this eventually led to him moving to England. He spent some time there, composing and doing things, working for the royal family, working in various places in England and for various nobles. But he officially moved there in 1718, became a citizen in 1727 of Britain. And then when he became a citizen, he was appointed the composer of the Chapel Royal. They were unable to do that until he was a citizen. So Handel, like, just a great vocal and instrumental composer. There are like I said, lots of great music by Handel. You'll get to hear two. You'll get to hear an example of the oratorio and the Baroque from the water music. But so in oratorio, remember, this is different from an opera because it's not staged. It's very, very similar. You have a lot of similar things. You have arias, you have solos, you have the chorus, you have an orchestra, but it's not staged. It's kind of like going to a concert instead of like a play. And instead of playing the Hallelujah chorus, which I kind of get sick of hearing that, we're going to do Every Valley, which is a very famous tenor aria. So it's for a male singer. This is like the third piece in the whole thing. There are three parts. The first part is part one is like the Christmas section, one that you hear performed a lot around Christmas time because it's about the coming of Jesus. So like I said, aria for tenor and orchestra. There's a lot of word painting in this. So um, you know, uh, in the text, it's every valley shall be exalted. So a lot of times when you hear him sing the exalted part, there's a lot of like rapid ascension. It's like you're going to hear the musical line go up a lot. So he does use that Renaissance tool, the word painting, to be very expressive in this. Um, so you guys will listen to this one. So every valley shall be exalted. It's a really great aria. It's, and at least you get to hear a tenor. You've gotten two examples of males singing opera. Usually people think of females singing opera, but that's not the case. I mean, think of Pavarotti and Placido. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. And Placido Domingo and all the others. Like I mean, there are great women and men singers in opera. It's not just for women. And here's the beret from Water Music. It will be like a typical kind of orchestra of the time, harpsichord, string instruments, and I think this one has oboe, bassoon, and natural horns, which French horn. I hate saying French, but it's the precursor to the horns, to the French horns that you guys know. They don't have valves, basically. So you guys can listen to that. And now we're to our last person, the big daddy of them all, Johann Sebastian Bach. So Bach really is one of the most important composers of all time. I mean, outside of Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, like those are the big three of the classical era. We'll talk about them. But Bach, man. And the sad thing is that during his time, during his lifetime, like everybody respected him as an organist and all that stuff. Like he was a great performer. but nobody like took him seriously until about 50, 100 years after his death. And they started to look back at his music and they were like, man, this is good. Like, and we in music school, like we study Bach's music. Like that is what we use in theory to learn how to do all this stuff. Like composers now, like they study Bach to learn how to write really good music. So he was just not just an amazing performer, but just an amazing musician, amazing composer in general. So, like I said earlier, he died in 1750. That is considered to be the end of the Baroque. You know, the greatest composer of the Baroque era dies. That's the end, plain and simple. Interesting facts: he had 20 children, not by the same wife. He was married a couple of times. Um, but yeah, 20 children, and several of them went on to become composers themselves. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, we call him CPE Bach, Johann Christian Bach. I think there's a Wilhelm Bach that became a composer. But yeah, several of them followed in their father's footsteps. And Bach came from a musical family anyway. Like his relatives were all organists, composers. None of them were very like I don't want to say popular, but they weren't like very high status, but they were well respected throughout Germany. Um, Bach was actually orphaned. I think around the age of 10, and he went to live with uncles and cousins and stuff like that. I mean, thankfully he had a large family, but I mean that would have been really tough. There's also a famous story that Bach, he was an organist, and there was this really famous organist of the time. His name was Buxtehude, and Buxtehude was performing in a town that was like miles away from where Bach lived, and Bach like couldn't find a carriage or a horse or anything to go there, so he walked several miles, like spent like a day walking just so he could see this great player perform. It was that kind of drive that made Bach into the great composer that he was. He held lots of different positions, some in like the Lutheran church, not Catholic, but the Lutheran church, so Protestant. So he wrote a lot of cantatas. Um, and he also worked in a few different courts as a musician. Um, he also composed works for himself and his friends, which is different. He's not just writing works for people, for his employers. He was writing works for others to enjoy and to perform, which is kind of revolutionary. Um, Went blind later in his life, but kept composing. He actually had some of his sons notate the music for him when he couldn't see anymore. No, very well known for his keyboard, organ, and harpsichord compositions, but wrote so much music. His writing is very polyphonic, so it's like the Renaissance, but instead of being for voices and being polyphonic, it's instrumental. And when you write instrumental polyphonic music, they call it contrapuntal. I don't know why they have to be difficult and be different, but that's just the term that's used. And his best contrapuntal works are the fugues. So the fugues, they have like a subject, the main melody, a counter subject, the secondary melody, and then other things that go on. Usually there's like two or three voices, two or three melodies that are going on at the same time. Um, so these are very polyphonic. And typically they're written for keyboard. I think he wrote most of his for organ. So that's in the video, you'll see it performed on organ. So these pieces would serve as prelude to like traditional worship services. So Bach wrote a lot of fugues, so many, because you think like he wrote he was so prolific. Like he didn't like to reuse things, so he wrote new music for almost every single church service that he had to write music for. So it's a lot. He wrote a lot of music. Um, like I said, taking vocal polyphony, applying it to a keyboard instruments. The subject, the melody is passed around all three of the voices. It starts in one hand, then it goes to the next, and then it goes. So organ, you've got left hand, right hand, and feet. So you've got three things that play together. So it will start in usually the right hand, go to the left, and then go to the feet. So it's passed around three times and more. And it would be a really good idea when you listen to this to follow the chart that's in the chapter, because the timing, like it gives you specific timings of when the subject happens, when it's passed around, like when new things start to come in. And that would be really helpful to any of you that are kind of confused about the whole polyphonic thing. So have fun listening to this one. It's called The Little Fugue. Don't know why, just but yeah, that's just what they call it. A fugue in G minor, um, for organ. So that's pretty much it. We have a lot of new developments, a lot of new forms and genres, new instruments, new performing forces like the orchestra. So lots of new things. The center of music shifts here. So we're going from Italy to Germany and Austria. I mean, Germany and Austria, like they're part of the same Austrian Empire for the next like few hundred years. So they're kind of one and the same, but not really. I know, but Vienna, Berlin, like Germany, that's Vienna, Austria is really like the center, the new center of music in Europe, and you'll see that once we talk about the classical era. The superstar composers, Bach, Handel, it just continues with Beethoven and Mozart. They just keep getting bigger and bigger. The court musicians and patronage, I mean, you can see how it's changing from everyone being supported by the Catholic Church to, you've got church positions in the Protestant churches. You've got lots of different patronage through nobles and lords and kings and queens and all those sorts of things. So that sets up a lot of different avenues for composers to take. Like, you don't have to be tied into just writing sacred music. You can kind of write a whole bunch of different things. The program music, we're going to come back to program music during the Romantic era, but it is starting here. You can see that with Spring. And the water music, music for the royal fireworks, I mean, those are kind of programmatic too, just not to the same extent as the Four Seasons by Vivaldi. Now, for the listening assignment, you're going to listen to Bach's Brandenburg Concerto Number 1, Movement 1. So he wrote six concertos for full orchestra. So strings, I think flute, oboe, bassoon, no clarinets yet, and the natural horns. So full orchestra. He wrote these as a gift to the Margrave of Brandenburg. He thought that if he did this, that the Margrave would employ Bach. Like he really wanted to be employed by the Margrave of Brandenburg. He thought that would be a great position, a great place for him and his family, but it didn't happen. Um, so, but we still have these concertos. They're really awesome pieces of music. But this is just kind of so you can see what the full orchestra looks and sounds like during the Baroque era. It'll look small compared to what we're kind of used to nowadays, and you'll see as we go to the Romantic era, that the orchestra just keeps getting bigger, and you keep adding more instruments, more strings, and newer instruments like the brass and and like clarinet. So enjoy that. Don't forget to do the discussion and the test and all that stuff. So just let me know if you guys have any questions. Um, and yeah, just email me and I'll get to you as soon as I can. So thanks. Have a good week.